chapter 5. We're going to be there again tonight. But before we do, Andy, one thing you said, you were talking about the lady who came in and things were not going well. It reminded me of something I've heard from a pastor that shared 3 knots that should be triggers for inviting someone to church. And so he gives these 3 knots. Things are not going well, things I was not prepared for, or I am not from here. So I just wanted to mention that, those 3 things are not going well. It reminded me of that situation. It's a really good invitation often when someone's willing to open up to you that something's not going well. Sometimes God has put someone in your life that you may have been through something and you've seen God's hand in it, how he helps you, how he guided you through it and matured you. And in that moment, he's given you comfort so that you may bring comfort to that person and invite them into the community that helped you through it. So things are not going well. B, it should perk your ears up. Maybe I need to invite this person to my church. Invite them to my small group. Invite them to whatever it is so that they could hopefully receive the same comfort I've received. Things I was not prepared for. So this could be, I'll give you an example right now. I was not prepared for marriage and how hard it can be. And you could say, well, let me tell you about this class that we're doing in my church where we are actually going through how do you have a marriage that lasts and goes through all the difficulties of life. And when you married someone that's not who you thought you were marrying, how do you make it through this? That's a good time. Your ears should perk up. Things I was not prepared for. The third thing is I'm not from here. So I'm not from this area. It's usually a new person. They're coming in. They've got a new job or school, and they're looking for community. I mean, especially coming on the heels of COVID and how isolated people were, I think we've learned to appreciate community, even if we're maybe worse at having community now than we were before. We realize there's kind of this void. So someone says, I'm not from here, should perk your ears up. So the 3 knots. Things are not going well. I was not prepared for. I am not from here. So any of those things you hear, kind of let them perk your ears up. Maybe God's putting this person in my life to invite them into the community I have. But that's a little side. Tonight, we're going to get to Matthew chapter 5. And I'm just going to read the most famous part of this section, starting in verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the humble, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. You are blessed when they insult you and persecute you and falsely say every kind of evil against you because of me. Be glad and rejoice, because your reward is great in heaven. For that is how they persecuted the prophets who were before you. This passage, as we're going to walk through it tonight, I believe is kind of showing the transition of a person from being a person who is in a fallen world, who is broken, who is bankrupt morally and spiritually, to a person who now can claim the kingdom of heaven as theirs. And what's interesting is the changes that occur through that process. I don't think these are just a bunch of non-connected elements that Jesus is pointing out about godly people. In fact, as we kind of dig into this, it's going to be some of these things are very unflattering things to say about someone. But let's just begin with the first one, the poor in spirit. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. If you go to this world, which is patokos in Greek, and look at what it means, It means pertaining to being economically disadvantaged. You're broke, is basically what it means. Pertaining to being thrust on divine resources. It's kind of that person who's coming to the altar has nothing left, just falling at the mercy of God. It means lacking in spiritual worth. It's a potential translation for it. Being spiritually worthless. Pertaining to being extremely inferior in quality, miserable, shabby. So if I was asking you, what is a characteristic of someone who can claim the kingdom of heaven as theirs, I don't think your first adjective would be miserable and shabby. And Jesus is saying something that is a stark contrast with the culture he's at. In fact, almost every human culture. When you start to pick your team, if you go to any middle school, any high school, we all know that kid who's the last one picked for every sport. The one who's tall and lanky and looks like a baby giraffe that's just landed right after he's been born, that he tries to pick the dodgeball up and hits himself in the face with it. Like, we know that kid. We've seen him, and we don't choose him. He's miserable, shabby, inferior in quality, disadvantaged. And this is exactly who Jesus is trying to call to mind when he starts this off by saying, this is the type of person who the kingdom of heaven belongs to. Jesus is not the person who goes to the dodgeball court choosing the people who are going to play on his kingdom of heaven team and start saying, you're the strongest and mightiest, I choose you. You come from the wealthiest family, I choose you. In fact, he chooses the person that seems to be the most disadvantaged. Why would that be the case? I don't think it's just arbitrary. And I think Jesus reveals that as he continues on. The next passage is about those who mourn. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. You know, a unique perspective that a person who is disadvantaged has is they're more keenly aware to certain broken parts of the circumstances in the world around them. They see what it's like to be oppressed. They see what it's like to be the last person always picked, and they know the shame and the humiliation that they have to deal with. They're not looking around at the system and thinking, I want to keep things the way they are. They're often the ones that are looking around and saying, the system is really broken, and they mourn. They feel the shame standing there as the last person on court, where the team that is lacking a person for their team would rather not even have them on the team than pick them. They feel that shame. They feel the brokenness of what's going around, the injustice, and they're aware of it, and they mourn. So when Jesus says this, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Maybe the distinct thing that's standing out about this person who is shabby and miserable is they're seeing something in the circumstances around them that those who are advantaged, those who are well off, those who are strong and mighty are willing to overlook because it benefits them. They're willing to keep it going because they're comfortable with it. And Jesus says that person who's able to look around and see what is causing those who are the least among them to be oppressed and rejected, they will be comforted. Blessed are those who are humble, for they will inherit the earth. The word there, praus, means pertaining to not being overly impressed by a sense of one's self-importance. It means to be gentle, humble, considerate, meek. To be humble. It's interesting that word, the last one, meek, is actually a word that Jesus used to describe the very inner part of who he was. Come to me, for I am meek. In Matthew 5, or Matthew 11. Jesus himself held that up as an attribute that should be striven for, not something that should be seen as shameful or diminished. But if you think about that, the analogy of standing on the dodgeball court, you don't want the meekest person on your team. They are going to eat a dodgeball to the face. They're not going to help you win the game. They're not going to be the most standing up. You want the proud person. You want the person who's worked out 6 days a week for since he was 3. You want the person you're convinced is on steroids. You don't want meek. But Jesus, when he's describing those who inherit the kingdom, it's those who are meek, who are humble. I think this is a continuation of this story Jesus is weaving. It's the person who's rejected, who's bankrupt, who's despised, who's disadvantaged, who sees the brokenness in the world and mourns it. Even if it's for selfish reasons, he mourns it. He sees this is not how this world was intended to be. It was not supposed to be a survival of the fittest type world. This was supposed to be something where human beings were loved and shown dignity because they were made in their God's image and they bore his image. And he mourns. And through that mourning, it actually can teach you to be humble. It can teach you to say, this was how I was treated. I will not treat others the same way. It's quite interesting to me that if you look at how generous a person is, sometimes it seems like this is not always the case, because I know there are those who are the exception to this. But sometimes it seems like it's the people who have the least who are the most generous with what they have. And maybe the reason why they are like that is because they've seen what it's like for those who are wealthy to withhold their wealth, to treasure it for themselves, even when they were in need. And they thought, I will never be like that to those who are in need around me. It's if you go to impoverished sections of communities, I've heard people who are sharing their stories about growing up in very poor areas. For you to steal from someone else in that area was one of the most heinous things you could do. Because they were all in this mentality of, we're broke, we're poor, so we have to care for one another if we're going to make it through this. And for you to have that selfishness where you would essentially condemn someone else to total poverty for the sake of just a little bit of help for yourself for a moment, it was this breaking of kind of a social contract in that area. Blessed are those who are poor in spirit, who mourn the brokenness in the world, who are humble, who are meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Something that happens in that, when you see the world around you as broken, when your heart is humbled and you're mourning what you see as evil in this world and people not being built up and supported, and your heart is humbled and you turn and start to try to mend that, is your heart starts to look more like your God's. Your heart starts to reflect a God who longs for justice and righteousness. And that word there, righteousness, it's not just good acts, devoid. Sometimes we can think of righteousness as just kind of having a good mentality, having good intentions. But all throughout Scripture, the word righteousness and justice are used interchangeably with one another. Because what was the greatest commandments? To love God, to love neighbor. Righteousness is justice because it is you acting as God would toward his creation. It is you using your abilities, your giftings, your resources to live out the heart of your Father for those around you. Righteousness is not a personal thing just between you and God. In fact, God makes it very clear that if you say you love me, yet you do not love your brother and sister, you are a lie. To be righteous is to be someone who seeks justice, who seeks the way that God has intended things to be a restorer of order, which is what justice is ultimately aimed at. God's justice is not aimed at punishment. We need to get those two things separated. Is it true that God will punish the wicked? Yes, but his heart is to restore order first. His heart is to bring about mending, which is why there is a willingness on God's part not to punish the wicked if he can restore them instead. All of us are sitting in this room as a benefit of that. If God's entire point of his justice was to punish, there would be no Savior. But because his heart is not just about punishment, his heart is about restoring. His heart is about mending. And so for those who are poor in spirit, who are mourning, who are humbled, they seek to be instruments of God's righteousness around them. This is why God even rebuked Israel. In Isaiah 58, God says, "Cry out loudly. Don't hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet. Tell my people their transgression and the house of Jacob their sins. They seek after me day after day and delight to know my ways. Like a nation that does what is right and does not abandon the justice of their God. They ask me for righteous judgments. They delight in the nearness of God." I think there's some sarcasm in that statement because of what we're about to read. "Why have we fasted, but have not seen you?" This is the voice of Israel crying out now. "We have denied ourselves, but you haven't noticed. God, we did all the fasting you asked us to do. Why aren't you listening to us? Look, you do as you please on the day of your fast. You oppress all your workers. You fast with contention and strife to strike viciously with your fist. You cannot fast as you do today, hoping to make your voice heard on high. Will the fast I choose be like this, a day for a person to deny himself and bow his head like a reed, and to spread out sackcloth and ashes? Will you call this a fast and a day acceptable to the Lord?" Does that sound like someone mourning, which was to put on sackcloth, humbling themselves? "Isn't this the fast I choose?" Listen to this if this doesn't sound like righteousness next. "To break the chains of wickedness," or justice. "To untie the ropes of the yoke, to set the oppressed free, to tear off every yoke. Is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and homeless into your house, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not to ignore your own flesh and blood? Then your light will appear like the dawn, and your recovery will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the Lord's glory will be your rear guard." It is impossible to separate righteousness with loving those who are suffering because of the brokenness in the world around us. And he continues, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." What does it mean to be merciful? It means to be concerned about people in their need, merciful, sympathetic, compassionate. After you have endured the brokenness of this world and it has caused you to mourn, you've then been humbled and then realized the way that you were to show your response to this, the only appropriate way, is to become an instrument of mending the world around you, of breaking the chains of those who are oppressed. That's what righteousness is ultimately about us helping to set people free through our actions. Why do we no longer enjoy this sin? It's not just because God said bad. It's because when we enjoy this sin and constantly indulge in it, we're telling people that God's ways aren't truly the way to freedom. That's what we're telling them, even if our mouths aren't saying it. And so we go through this. Blessed are the Merciful, for they will be shown mercy. What's the heart of a person that seeks to bring justice, to bring order and restoration? It's a heart of compassion that says, as God saw me in this brokenness and responded with compassion, so I will respond to those in brokenness around me. I won't leave people there, because that person reminds me of where I was. That person reminds me of how I'm looking at them and saying, I have no desire to be with them or around them, or I don't want to put in the time and effort that it's going to cost me to help serve this person. And I'm sure they're going to take advantage of my grace, and there's going to be times that I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and they'll prove me wrong. But yet God could have said the same thing about me when I was standing on that court, the last person no one else would have chose. But he had mercy, compassion. He responded out of righteousness and justice. Then finally, well, not finally, but next, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. These are the pure in heart. This reminds me very much of what we've been talking about in John, especially this past Sunday. That as we choose to walk in God's ways, we get to know him and to commune with him in a more intimate way. Like two friends who may have just barely known each other at the beginning of a very long journey. But after they've traveled miles and miles and miles, gone through each experience and met challenges and trials and overcome them together, they get to the end of that journey knit together, almost inseparable. And just like how that is with us, with God, he here is reaffirming, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Not blinding light in some kind of bodily form coming down and seeing it with our eyes. God's not flesh and bone like us, but see God, see the character of God in display around him. See the heart of God as they get to show love for others and see God's heart reflected in it. That's been some of the sweetest times in my life, have been when I did what I knew was right, and at the end of it, could just tell God was with me in that moment. I may have been doing it begrudgingly at the start of it and not wanted to, and yet in that moment, it's like God is speaking to me and saying, do you see me? Do you see this is my heart? You wanted to walk away from this. You didn't want to be a part of this. Yet you finally got to see what my heart is like towards them, and this is what my heart is like towards you. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And notice that this comes after righteousness. If we are going to see God, it comes from us walking with him. It comes from us being knit together with him. It doesn't come first. It's not like God shows up and says, here I am. Now go serve me. He doesn't put everything on display on the front side of it and dump all of this head knowledge into us. So we're not made to learn like that. He made us to commune with him, to walk with him. And as we choose to walk in obedience, as we choose to mourn the brokenness in the world, to humble ourselves before him, as we choose to be pure in heart, undefiled, as we show justice and righteousness to people, as we are merciful ourselves to those who don't deserve it, we see the heart of our God. And then he continues, blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. I had a quote that I'm going to read from this book I talked about 2 weeks ago, What If Jesus Was Serious? The popular perception of peacemakers, perhaps influenced by the world's negative connotation in both politics and counseling, is that of weakness and avoidance. We view peacemakers as people who desire the appearance of serenity by suppressing any visible conflict and who avoid the difficult and costly work of forging real reconciliation. Such people, however, are not peacemakers, they are peace fakers. Avoiding conflict is not the way of God and does not make us his children. The Apostle Paul tells us that God has reconciled to himself all things, making peace by the blood of his cross. Through the cross, we discover God's kind of peacemaking. It is costly and painful. Jesus forged peace, not by denying the presence of evil in the world or by avoiding its power, but by courageously facing it head on. It was a hard-won peace worthy of God's praise. Peacemaking is not avoiding, it's not having fake relationships where we pretend like everything is the same. I'll just point this example out. There can be many times that we think that we should separate ourselves in different groups based on certain allegiances to other things. And I'm going to step on some of our toes. I'm going to step on a lot of people's toes. One of those things is politics. We think that if someone shows up and they're of a different political allegiance than us, they're not one of us. And I'm not saying that a certain political group is more right or more wrong than the other. I'm not interested in trying to debate that at all right now. What I am saying is I've sat in homes of members of this church who are both Republicans and Democrats, and both loved Christ. And what we have here, peacemakers, is sometimes in these culture, in these environments that we create, we can think that the best way to have peace is by avoiding talking about difficult things like politics. Just put it aside. And I'll tell you, what we've seen over the past 6 years, and what we're going to continue to see over this next several years, as politics is something that's just dividing people from themselves, is we don't get through this by avoiding hard conversations. We get through this by being people who walk through this whole process, who see the brokenness in the world, who mourn it, who try to live out righteousness and justice in this, who act with mercy, who are peacemakers, who are willing to have the hard conversations. But it's never so that we can prove the other side is wrong. It's so that we can show each other the wonder of Christ. I genuinely believe, and we're going to talk more about this topic throughout this night. Use the topic of abortion. There's some who will say that no Christian could ever vote for X. And I know that's not true. My brother would be one of those people who many would say is just not a Christian. Here's what I do believe, though. If I win people to Christ, their values, their understanding of justice and mercy is going to start to align more with what Jesus expresses. When someone walks into this door, into this church, we could have someone who walks in and shares none of the normal beliefs that we have in this church. My priority is to show them Christ. Because me telling them, just immediately going to attacking some political party or attacking their position on a specific issue is not going to lead to heart change. There are plenty of people who share every political conviction I have and don't love Jesus. My heart is to make people who love Jesus. And what that's going to mean is it will be messy, it will be costly, it will require hard conversations. But are we going to be peacemakers like Jesus Christ was, who was willing to lay his life down to make peace? Who was willing to be meek and humble himself in how he brought correction? Who never picked up a sword to try to defend himself, instead showed love and compassion and was winsome, and the gospel that he brought changed lives. My goal is not to make Democrats or Republicans. My goal is to make people who love Christ. And if I do that, It's where we're going to have real change. Anyway, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. People who live like Jesus has just laid out will not be embraced by everyone in this world. They may speak evil of us that is not true. They may try to sideline us and reject us and ridicule us, which I think, just my take in our country, when I've seen the persecution that other people in other nations face, when I have sat in restaurants with missionaries who are serving overseas that have to use coded language to protect themselves while they're in country, where I would have to call them M's. I couldn't say missionary. Because the environment of the country is, if they hear missionary, a normal person in the restaurant heard missionary, they would target this person. And when I've left that country and found out that that very thing was happening to the missionary I was working with, and that he had to get out of country because he had people start asking about him in the city that we were in, I don't think we're persecuted for being Christians. I do think sometimes we can use that a little bit too liberally to talk about being persecuted when someone doesn't like what we're saying. That's a part of what it means to be an American with having the right to speak. Is it's not about everybody liking what you say. It's that you have the right to make it winsome. You have the right to speak it in a way that's compelling. And we have the most compelling message when we truly believe it, when we truly buy into it and we truly live it out. Anytime Christians have, it's been the most compelling thing. That even when they speak evil against the Christians, the people in the community would look around and say, we know we're saying this, but we also know it's not really true of the Christians we know. So what do I have to say about this? Because this is probably the most political message I've had. I'm going to get a little more political. I'm going to use the issue of abortion, because it's been a very hotly debated, very politicized issue in our context. And I want to propose a different way of going about this. Something that I'm bringing up with you guys for us as a church to start thinking and praying through. How do we address this issue? If the most pro-life thing I ever do in my life is vote for a pro-life candidate, I'm not pro-life. How do we as Christians actually help to protect and serve life? Well, I think let's use this passage as a model. Do we see the total lack of ability, it seems like, to address this issue? Are we poor in the spirit of that we just are throwing ourselves on God's divine resources and saying, God, people have tried to address this for so long and we haven't been able to get a foothold? I think that's the posture we have to take, as one of humility before God, and say all of man's best resources have been thrown at this. Billions of dollars have been thrown at this. And still, children are dying by the droves due to abortion. Do we mourn that? Does it grieve our hearts to think of those who are made in God's image, who are suffering unduly because of the brokenness in the world around us? Do we then humble ourselves before Him and just pray and say, God, help us to address this issue? Help us to care for those who are going through this. Help us to care for the victims. Help us to care for the people who are misguided and misunderstanding. God, just help us to address this issue in a way that brings healing. Do we hunger and thirst for righteousness, for justice? Are our hearts stirring within us where we're saying, God, we can't bear that this is going on. Will you ever satisfy us? Will you fix this? Do we have mercy for those who are affected by it? I think that's where two extremes can go on this issue. There can be those who cry out for mercy and no justice. They cry out for mercy and just say, have compassion. And I think that's the error of one side. Have compassion. Just kind of let them do as they want to. We can have the other side that cries out, justice, justice, justice. And there's no mercy or compassion. Let's be people of both. Cry out for justice. Have mercy. Blessed are those who are pure in heart. Are our motives pure in what we're pursuing and what we're trying to do? Is this for the sake of bringing healing and restoration? Blessed are those who are peacemakers. Do you know it's difficult work to walk into the life of a mother who decides to keep her baby, who has no resources, and is going to be demanding of you? Do you know that you're going to have to deal with past broken relationships, and you're going to have to walk into the messy, muddy, messed up life that this child is about to be born in? Are you committed to being a peacemaker in that situation? Not a peace faker, not a give some money and walk away, not a just kind of get them out of my mind. A peacemaker, someone who's walking into these dark situations that says, I will depend on the Spirit of Christ to bring peace in all the brokenness that's before me. I think this is a more helpful way of thinking about it. Now, I bring this up because there's something that I've been in talks with for a couple of months now, and I'm bringing up for our church to start thinking through and processing, how do we be a part of this? You know, just something that will kind of make you maybe mourn even a little more on this. You know, Georgia has the heartbeat bill that was passed. Well, when Roe v. Wade was passed, Ricky Smith, who's the pastor at Calvary, started going around and trying to figure out, how do we now help mothers who decide to keep their babies? So he started talking with pregnancy centers and different people in the area to figure out kind of what's going on as a result. And one of the things that they actually told him was that after the heartbeat bill, abortions increased. And the reason why was because a heartbeat is normally detected at 6 weeks. Mothers, if they're very conscientious about potentially being pregnant, usually are late around 4 weeks or earlier. And about that time, a home pregnancy test will work for you to find out that you're pregnant. Take a mother, for example, who is impoverished, has a broken home life, who does not have a community around her to support her with this child. She's thinking about the scholarship she just got that's going to help her go to college, and how she's finally going to be able to try to get out of this broken situation she's in. And all of a sudden now she finds out she's pregnant, and it's going to just, her life at that point looks like never escaping this situation she's in. Used to, that mother had weeks, possibly months, to think through whether or not to abort this child. Now, with the heartbeat bill, it's 2 weeks. 2 weeks she has to make that decision. How many of you could figure out all of those problems in your life in 2 weeks? That's the main thought about why abortions are increasing, is because the decision to keep the child's been reduced to a matter of days. Instead of having weeks to think through and process, how do I get this community around me? Who's going to help me with this? How am I going to make it through all this? Instead of having the time for a group of people to say, we want you to keep the child and we're going to help support you to make your still get to go to school. And maybe even in this broken situation, a parent says, I'll raise the child as my own. You don't have to keep the child as your child. You go to college, I'll raise the child. Instead of that, the decision sped up. So what Ricky has found, is that legislation did not fix the problem. And it never will. If we are truly about saving those children, it means mobilizing people to be people who are poor in spirit, who mourn the broken world, who humble themselves, who seek righteousness, who are merciful, who are peacemakers, and who go out and try to help someone in this situation. And so what Calvary is starting to develop, and I've been at 3 meetings now, talking through this, thinking through it, is developing what's called maternity homes. in the area, which are homes for mothers who find out they're pregnant, where they can come and live for the duration of the pregnancy and up to 18 months afterwards. And during that time, helping them with things like getting a GED, getting CNA certifications or other types of technical certifications to help them with finances, teaching them life skills in order for them to support a family and help raise a family in a good situation, providing for entering into the messy parts of this person's life to help them move forward. I bring this to our attention as a church. We have made no decision or commitment on what level of involvement we're going to have. But I bring it up to you because this is what it looks like to be someone who's tackling these issues in our world. And it may be that we have something to do with them. It may be that God opens up an entirely different direction. But I wanted to use a highly charged, highly political example, which is almost never advised of any pastor to ever do in their career, to say God has a way to do this. It's not like he left us without hope and without a template. I mean, he spells it out pretty clearly. It's, are we going to pursue it in that way? The place we start, I believe, is by being poor in spirit, by mourning the situation that exists, and by humbling ourselves to see how we may move forward with this issue. And so I'm going to ask us tonight just to pray over this issue. I've gone a little bit longer than I normally do. It's a very important thing. I want us to start praying as a church. How do we become someone who helps address the real situation? Our goal is not to just say we're pro-life. Our goal is to be pro-life, to live it out, to be people who support and help sustain life. And that's sometimes costly. But how do we do this as a church? We need prayer. We need God's guidance on this. So let us pray for this for a couple of minutes.